quiet. Heed the call of heritage. Scrape back the thin veneer of modernity. Grasp and raise again that which has lain so long in dust. From the tales you tell and the songs you sing to the very food that feeds you. Join us now in finding folklore. All things must start, and always there's a first. Once upon a long time ago, all the Middle Earth was water, and in those drowned days there was no land left above the waves, and there were no people, and there was no hunting or farming, no singing or storytelling, and what a rotten state of wet nothing it was. With days that meant nothing and nights that meant nothing and weeks and months that meant even less. In a world that is all water, no time exists. So this state lasted and did not last for just as long as it did, and on it did then, until the time that it did not. And until the time the water thought a speck into being, and was no longer all. And until the time the speck thought itself into something more. And across the waters then the something more floated. And the something more then thought itself into wood. And the wood then thought itself to a skiff. And the skiff thought itself into something more again. Into a naked baby boy. And at his feet there lay strange weaponry. And at his back a shield. And beneath his head a sheaf of corn. And this baby boy, alone in all the world, thought sun and cloud above and saw it, and thought mountain and landscape and saw it, and thought a people. And when his skiff reached ashore, the people he had thought into being were there. And they raised him up, and they hailed him as their king, and they armed themselves with his weapons, and they shielded themselves with his shield, a battle mighty and a wandering people. And from his sheaf of corn they grew. Field on field, farm on farm, village on village, and no longer did they wander. And the people learned to still, to grow themselves, to root. And from his sheaf civilization grew. And they named him Skeefer. And Skeefer grew as they did. Once upon a long time ago, Skeefer, who some call Sheaffer, some call Shave, some call Sheaf, still a boy, was walking through the land which was his, and which now was firm and solid beneath his growing feet. And as he went on his way, Skeefer came upon many things. He walked once past a great tree, and once past a wide river, and once beneath the gaping sky, until he came to an undergrowth, and there found he the dusty bones of a long-forgotten man. On hand and knee he crouched then, and reached and touched the bloodwood. And as he felt it, cold in his palm, Skeefer remembered then the life that once it had led. And before him there stood a grim, old hooded man, who put a rough palm gentle against his smooth boy's face, stared him in the eye, and let the madness of his gaze fill him. With an intake of breath, Skeefer was alone once more. After a moment, he took up a dry bone, and from the ground beneath it took a flint. On instinct then he scratched and he hollowed and he carved. And he took up another bone and more, and with his newfound instinct, with the mind that grew beneath his mind, he crafted there an instrument. And on that instrument Skeefer played such songs, the first of man's music. And with that instrument Skeefer sang such songs, songs that began in hello and ended in goodbye, and that sang of a past that could never be returned to. His music filled and fed the minds of men, and blessed them with a taste of the madness he had tasted once himself. There grew the first blossoms of civilization. There were tamed the beasts within, and so was given the divine to the monstrous. And so warriors were turned to farmers, and farmers turned to harpmen. So strength turned to prosperity, and prosperity grew to art. Many years passed, and the songs Skeefer sang and the music Skeefer played grew as he did, and soon Skeefer was a man, and that was a good king of the people who were his, a wise and otherworldly ruler, who through his taste of madness thought beyond himself, and could see things that others could not, and could stare through time to envision worlds centuries apart, and could see the sounds and feel the notes to the tunes that connected them all. Often would that king walk out, alone, through wood, over river, under hill, until he came to the hooded man with the madness in his eye. Skeefer would play then, and sing such songs. Time rolled on, as time has a tendency to do, and the threat of war came to Skeefer's people. He walked then, and he walked, and he walked, and he played, until the hooded man came to him once more. Skeefer asked what he should do, and the rough palm went once more to his cheek, now bearded as a man's. The madness of the eye once more filled him, and with a gasp he was alone. Skeefer travelled then to the fertile land, and in the finest field he found the finest maid waiting for him. And she commanded he construct for her a wagon, which he did. And she commanded he bring to her the finest, whitest steeds to pull it, which he did. And she commanded he should join with her, which he did. And she led him then about in her wagon, and beat the bounds, and all who she passed threw garlands before her. When she gave birth to their baby boy, Skeefer gave his son the name of Scyld, which some call Shuld and some call Shield. He took his mewling newborn infant to the shore, and laid him there on the wood of a great drowned shield, and he lit a candle at his baby's head, and pushed his son out to sea. He watched the flickering flame retreat as the waves took them, toying with the tiny vessel, and he listened as Scyld cried, and watched as further it went from the shore, and further. The flame on the water paused, floated a moment, then drifted back the way that it had come, a gurgled laugh sounding as it did so, returned to the stones at Skeefer's feet. Skeefer's people were protected then in battle, and lived to fight another day, and Scyld grew up to be a man, and Scyld had a son, who he named Beowulf. Once more the threat of war came to the Skeefings. Once more Skeefer walked, and Skeefer played, and once more was he blessed with madcraft. And so, when Beowulf was born, Skeefer took Scyld to the shore again, and he held him close, and he praised him as his son, and he touched a rough palm to his face, and he held his gaze, and with his sax knife he cut into his middle, and held him tight as his son's legs buckled. Scyld felt his blood join the water then, and Skeefer laid his dying son onto the wood of that large round shield once more, and placed the bloodied sax knife at his feet, and lit the candle at his head, and pushed him from the shore. He stood and watched the light reach the horizon, watched the flame in the water, watched it disappear, watched it go out. And the sheafings once again were safe, and victorious in combat, for the mad craft showed them things that they had never known, and taught them ways of doing that had never been done, and never again in Skeefer's reign would battle threats return. But soon enough the Skeefings found a drought upon them, and crops dried, and trees withered, and people grew hungry. In dreams then the grim and hooded man came to Skeefer once more, and together in their frenzy they saw what must be done. So it was that Skeefer took the baby Beowa to the barren fields, and with the clear sight of madness in his eyes, he took up scythe and reaped the child. And he sowed Mother Earth with the blood and the bone and the flesh of him. The fields were ploughed then, and harrowed, and Beowa fed deep, and crops returned, and the Skeefings were well fed and bountiful once more. From the barley corn that there grew a special beer was made, which had been taught in dream to that mad-wise king. When he drank that beer he saw all things, did Skeefer, and understood much, and when the beer had passed he remembered fragments of his knowledge and sang them. And in this way the Skeefings swelled. And time came, and time passed, and time carried on, as time has a tendency to do. And Skeefer was old in his days then, too old, and many wintered, and the Skeefings needed leadership anew. And Skeefer understood his time was past. The old king went then to the fertile lands, and on to the finest field, which throve as it did, and he reaped a sheaf of the Beowa corn. And on he walked, deep to within his hall, and from a wooden box he took a sax knife, from the hoard that he had brought so long ago, ancient and entish and unlike any other seen. Skeefer picked up his bone harp then, and on it sang a song that began in goodbye and ended in hello, of age and of pain and of joy. And when he had done he left the harp upon his throne, and took up in its place a freshly made shield, brightly painted, clean and smooth and undented by battle. Skeefer walked away. He took himself to shore then, and there was the finest mother who once had been the finest maid, and she stood before the Skeefings, and they in turn stood before a boat of gold that glistened in the night. When Skeefer was aboard, he went to the centre of the ship, and he put down the corn for a pillow. He lay himself down likewise, and, as his people pushed the boat into the hands of the waves, he felt it heave and gently roil, and watched the sky go by above. And this old man, alone in all the world, thought moon and star above and saw it, thought eagle and raven and saw it, thought of a hooded father, a grandson and a son. He felt a rough palm on his cheek then, and saw the clear and spreading gaze of his father's madness, and with the sax knife he cut into the middle of himself, there atop the waves. The bleeding king tossed the knife so it fell below his feet. He covered his wound with his shield. He lit the pyre on which he lay, and as he burned he sang such songs. So Skeefer gave himself back to his father, back to the Middle Earth, back to the waters, a long time ago. And the Skeefings from the shore watched the fire in the water, until they watched it disappear. And in the fields then stood Beowa reborn, his beard thick now as a man's, full and long, his limbs full grown and strong, listening to his grandfather's song, and knowing the tune full well. And Beowulf sang then, such songs, songs that began in hello and ended in goodbye, and sang of a world that could never be returned to, and sang of a world that once could be regained. And Skeefer's heir took up his throne. And on another distant shore, a skiff reached land, piled high with arms and armour, and on this bed of blades a baby lay, and beneath his head a sheaf of corn. And they named the baby Skeefer, and civilization spread.
That was Of Sheaf and Shield. We'll be back to talk about it after A Long Time Ago.
A long, long time, a very long time to
Hey, way, hey, hey, yeah.
A long, long time, a very long time.
A long time ago.
A lonesome babe on the shore washed up to
Hey, way, hey, hey, yeah.
A lonesome babe on the shore washed up
A long time ago.
Sent all the waves by who knows who to
Hey, way, hey, hey, yeah.
Sent all the waves by who knows who.
A long time ago.
Beneath his head was a sheaf of corn to
Hey, way, hey, hey, yeah.
Beneath his head was a sheaf of corn.
A long time ago.
And for his bed on a shield he lay.
Hey, way, hey, hey, yeah.
And for his bed on a shield he lay.
A long time ago.
He throve and grew beneath the sky.
Hey, way, hey, hey, yeah.
He throve and grew beneath the sky.
A long time ago.
Great deeds he did in days gone by.
Hey, way, hey, hey, yeah.
Great deeds he did in days gone by.
A long time ago.
He emptied the benches of many mead halls to me.
Hey, way, hey, hey, yeah.
He emptied the benches of many mead halls.
A long time ago.
To him in time a child was born.
Hey, way, hey, hey, yeah.
To him in time a child was born.
A long time ago.
Across the sea road all bowed down to
Hey, way, hey, hey, yeah.
Across the sea road all bowed down.
A long time ago.
When old King Sheaf was dead and gone to
Hey, way, hey, hey, yeah.
When old King Sheaf was dead and gone.
A long time ago.
They carried him then back to the shore to
Hey, way, hey, hey, yeah.
They carried him then back to the shore.
A long time ago.
They placed him then on a golden ship to
Hey, way, hey, hey, yeah.
They placed him then on a golden ship.
A long time ago.
Sent all the waves to who knows who to
Hey, way, hey, hey, yeah.
Sent all the waves to who knows who.
A long time ago.
And all proclaimed that was a good king to
Hey, way, hey, hey, yeah.
And all proclaimed that was a good king.
A long time ago.
A long, long time, a very long time.
Hey, way, hey, hey, yeah.
A long, long time, a very long time.
A long time ago.
That was the Portsmouth Shantymen performing A Long Time Ago. And before that, you heard the story of Sheaf and Shield, performed by Brice Stratford. Hello, Brice.
Hello, Jimmy.
Welcome back for episode 3 of Finding Folklore.
Thank you, and welcome back to you to episode 3 of Finding Folklore.
And welcome to our listeners also to episode 3.
Welcome. I'm very happy you're here, lovely listeners. I'm very happy we're here.
Me too.
Yeah.
I will quickly just sum up what we do in this show.
Yes,
you tell a story,
tell
Brice.
The people. I do.
Brice tells a story at the beginning of the episode. Then we hear a piece of music, which is traditional music commissioned in a new recording by us, and then we talk about it.
We do. We
talk about
surely
it all.
do. We have a lovely meandering natter. If anybody hasn't heard this podcast before, that's what you've got to look forward to. I mean, you're already halfway through, so yeah. Now you understand.
We hope you've enjoyed it so far, and we hope you continue to enjoy it.
If you haven't listened to any other episodes, we have 2 others out thus far. The first is The Red King and the White Ship, about the mysterious death of William Rufus in the New Forest in the year 1100. And the second is Sprack Jack and the Pixies, a lovely old-style fairy tale.
I know those 2 are very different stories. They show a great kind of variety of styles of storytelling, even within the first 2. And I feel like this third one,
again, totally. Really, again, if you're looking for more of the same of what you've just heard, you'll be disappointed because essentially one of the motivators of this podcast is to really demonstrate the breadth and diversity of tradition just within the English folk tale canon. So these first 3 episodes really couldn't be more different in feel, I don't think. Certainly this one, wow.
Well, yeah. In fact, when we were recording all of these, it was when we got to this third one that I felt like it was a sort of story that I haven't really heard before. That it's got this kind of slow and peaceful, but very epic aspect to it. It's expansive in a way that I haven't heard much of before.
It's mythic. It feels
it is
mythic. It's heavier.
Well, actually, speaking of myth, this is from your book of myths from the other book.
Anglo-Saxon.
The previous 2 episodes were not.
Anglo-Saxon myths. Struggle for the 7 Kingdoms. Title chosen by the publisher.
It's a very pretty book.
It's a very pretty book. Please publish sequels, publisher. I wasn't criticizing the title. It's a great title. So it's good that you've picked up on that, because even though this is a set of myths, that doesn't preclude them, so far as I'm concerned, from being folk tales.
Oh, right.
When I refer to folk tales, by the way, in this, I'm talking about folk tales a lot. Some people use folk tales in a very specific or narrow sense.
Yeah.
To mean explicitly tales about the folk.
Which would be more in the line of, for instance, your smugglers' stories.
Yeah. I don't really use folk tales in that sense. I use the word the term folk tales to mean stories told by the folk. So just in the same way that folk music is music performed, sung and passed on through and by the folk, rather than songs about the folk. I've always thought that's kind of an odd reframing.
Yeah, you would definitely. I definitely find that a natural thing to think about the music. But maybe.
Well, sometimes people like to distinguish, and when I say people, I mean these are all specialists, right? The sort of people who waste their lives worrying about this sort of thing, like myself. They tend to say, okay, so myths are about the gods, legends are about heroes, folk tales are just about the humdrum everyday folk, right?
Yeah.
So in that context, it makes a little more sense, but I still don't feel that's right.
So for folk tale, you're talking about something that kind of encompasses all of the different stories that you tell.
Well, yeah, just as folk music incorporates many, many, many different songs from many, many, many different sources. And it's more about the context in which they're sung and the approach that is taken in performance.
Yeah, sure.
A lot of folk music now comes from the music hall tradition. And yet there is no question, it's been sung as folk music for 150, 200 years. So you can't say that isn't folk music. And so even though the early wave of collectors did try to separate that from folk music, nowadays you can't. It has very much become naturalized into folk music.
So of Sheaf and Shield, we're talking about it as a folk tale, but it's also it's myth.
Yeah, but in specifically, in some, it's either a myth or a legend. It's that strange intersection between the two. I also was conscious of sort of folkifying it for this performance in a sense, which is, I think, why it comes across slightly differently to the context of the book, which is a collection of myths and legends specifically.
Whether you wanted it to stand alone.
Well, yeah, it has to now because of the way we're telling it in this podcast. It is standing alone. As a consequence, it has to work in that form, that just slightly different form, I think. And so I think that's a lot of what's behind that. Even then, the changes are surprisingly minimal. You would be, a lot of the change simply feels different because it's out of the context it is in the book. I haven't changed as much as you would think. So, for example, the first episode, The Red King and the White Ship, I rewrote from scratch entirely. Yeah. The second episode, not much has changed, but that's because I wrote it in the book pretty much as oral storytelling. Yes. I transcribed
kind of
a lot.
Due to the way that you researched it.
Precisely,
and so on.
Whereas this one, again, slightly more has changed than it was in Sprack Jack, but nothing like the Red King. This really is still retains that mythic quality to its storytelling performance. But
which is strange that I found this story so surprising when we recorded it. I think we got to about halfway through this story, and then I suddenly clicked in my head that this felt like a ritual or a spell. Spell, of course, is an interesting word.
Yes, of course. Spell's a great word because, of course, spell is the Old English word for a story. So when you are telling a story, you are literally casting a spell.
And I found myself quite spellbound as I was
Which is what that word means, spellbound. Exactly what that word means.
So I mean, to me, this felt when you started telling it, this early section of the story, it felt a lot like a creation myth.
Creation myth.
So you have that section where all the world is water, and to me that was reminiscent of some other creation stories that I've heard, which begin with the universe as just a huge chaos, and little by little it's separated into the night and day, or the land and the water, and then it kind of progresses to the point where life is created. And the same thing seems to be happening in this story.
Very much so. And that's conscious to some degree in the way that I'm retelling it, because I'm aware of the Germanic precedents and antecedents. I'm aware of Gununga Gap and the
Could you tell me a little bit about that?
Well, Gununga Gap is not really relevant, but it's just it's the chaos, the yawning, the yawning void from which order is torn and then cohered to create the universe as we know it.
Great. But then this story seems to progress beyond that in a sort of accelerated timeline feeling where we reach further stages of civilization. We move from kind of warring, wandering tribes to settling and farming, and then to sort of higher civilization, which is creating art and then this civilization suffers various different disasters which are met by their ruler.
And it's
all happening in an accelerated timeline within a single lifetime.
Yeah, I mean, and essentially it is telling the story of a people in that sense, not in one lifetime, but in a much broader, wider thing. In this sense, we really are in a mythic mode. I referred in the last episode to the way that fairy stories and fairy tales often have a childlike logic to it, childish logic, child logic.
Yes.
Everything is done as if it's children playing a game. And so nothing really has much weight to it. Nothing counts for too much. Consequences aren't real. It's all a child game.
Yeah.
Now,
Gran Colin announces himself as being
precisely.
Dead and buried.
It's all just a fun. It's a fun performance.
Make believe.
Yeah. Whereas this is myths, true myths. You're not in child logic so much as you are in dream logic.
I was about to say dream logic. Yes, that seemed to me very much what's going on here.
Things, and this is normal. This is the way to, certainly the Germanic myths. We'll leave the Greek and the Celtic to one side.
Yeah.
But certainly the Germanic myths are best looked at and thought of as existing in dream logic rather than in any kind of literal or certainly any kind of linear real world context.
Yeah, sure.
And the dream logic in this, I think, is part and parcel of it. it can be both a literal story about these literal kings, but also this huge, great, sweeping tale of an entire race of people, an entire expansive culture, and also about all cultures and about culture in general. This is going to be a tricky one for us to talk about in this podcast, because there is so much detail to go into here. There is so much detail we can go into. There was so much work in, I say reconstruction of this story. It isn't, that's not even the correct word, because this story did not have to be reconstructed at all. It is told in many, many, many different contexts and analogues.
So there are, do I understand this right, that the most famous sort of source text of this is in Beowulf?
Yeah, this story is told in Beowulf right at the beginning. Yeah. More or less. So in Beowulf, it opens really by talking about shield sheafing.
What is shield sheafing?
Shield sheafing? Shield sheafing is this great king. According to the pronunciation...
okay.
So the pronunciation of the words, by the way, folks.
Yeah.
In the story, as I just told it, the king was called Scifa and his son was called Scyld. Now, those words, that's not how they should be pronounced in Old English. I believe they should be pronounced Sheafa and Shield or Shuld. And those words literally mean sheaf, as in a sheaf of corn, and shield, as in a shield.
And of course, this could get confusing.
This would get very confusing.
We are talking also about the objects, a sheaf of corn and a shield.
Because when you lay...
Which is why I got confused just there.
When you lay Sheafa with a sheaf of corn beneath his head, and then his son, Shield, is put on a shield, that's very difficult to really get across just through the podcast. So I made a conscious choice to pronounce them incorrectly, but in a way which is exactly how... In fact, if you gave that text written to any to the average to the man on the Clapham omnibus, if you told him to read those words, he would say Scifa and Scyld. That's how a modern English person would instinctually pronounce them. So I feel that in that respect, it's certainly appropriate. I kept the A on the end of Scifa because he's in many sources, in fact most sources, he's just called Skeef or Skef, sheaf or chef. But the earliest source is an Old English poem called Widsith, which is possibly the oldest poem, which we won't go into now, but it's a fascinating little poem, and it lists various kings and great heroes and warriors from ancient ages past. And that's the earliest reference to sheaf, to Scifa, and that's how it's spelled there.
I feel like Scifa is like that's quite intelligible to me. I can kind of get my head around it.
It feels right. Scifa sounds like it just feels right. Yeah. And again, with this stuff, I'm not trying to take you back and tell you exactly what Anglo-Saxons in 600 AD believed and exactly the story they told. I am trying to tell this story to the modern audience. I'm not trying to change it for the sake of changing it, but it is for a modern audience. I'm telling the stories for the audience that I've got, rather than pretending that the audience is. There are certain things you have to work around.
You're not going to tell the story in Old English.
No, I'm not. But
a very specific audience.
I will throw in certain things. Like there are certain direct translations in this story from the Beowulf retelling. Yeah, so back to this Beowulf thing. In the Beowulf retelling, and for anyone who doesn't know, Beowulf is the great epic of the Old English language.
This is with I don't know if anyone would know details of the story but not know the title, but it's the story with Grendel and Grendel's mother, and there's
in case you didn't know it was about Beowulf.
You know the story, but you don't know the name.
Sure.
Okay, go on, move on.
Old English is the oldest form of the English language. That then becomes Middle English, which is really more of a spectrum than a single language. That then becomes Early Modern English, which is the English of Shakespeare. And then that becomes Modern English, which is the English of that which we currently speak, right? So that's all those. How does we get onto this? Okay, so let me reverse. Those sorts of English. Then Beowulf. So Beowulf is the epic. The exact dating is who knows. The earliest likely dating is the 8th century, so in the 700s. Some people say earlier, but I think even that's too early.
But just very little survives from back then.
Very, very little. Others say it's the 800s or the 900s. I don't think it's later than 900s. But that's argued. Almost all scholars agree that Widsith is older.
Yep.
In Beowulf, obviously, the plot of Beowulf is that this hideous monster called Grendel
Also, now you're telling it, are you?
Well, I'm telling it instead of just saying it's the one about Grendel. There's this king called Hrothgar, and Hrothgar is descended from shield sheafing. Hrothgar is a brilliant old king, and he's built this amazing hall called Heorot, and it's so great. Everyone's so happy, but then this monster called Grendel comes and starts killing everybody. Time goes by, everyone's really bummed because of how much murder Grendel is committing. So eventually Beowulf comes to hear of it, and Beowulf decides to sail over the sea to Heorot and to kill Grendel and save the day. That's sort of the beginning, the essence, the context in which the story of Beowulf begins.
Mm-hmm.
As I say, it starts with talking not about Beowulf or even about Hrothgar, but about Hrothgar's ancestor, shield sheafing or skeeld skeffing, if we're going to use the this simpler pronunciation. I think we will stick with that, just to make it easier. So skeeld skeefing is what we'll call them. Now, that caused in itself some debate over the meaning, the construction of this, because of course in this it's about skeeld rather than about skeefer.
Yeah.
So skeeld is this ancestor.
Your,
and in fact,
your story definitely puts skeefer
first,
as the protagonist.
This nature of him as a composite character in the Beowulf tradition is really interesting. For reasons we won't, I think they get a bit too dense to go into now, but we'll deal with this in the deep dive. There's this element whereby combining the shield character, who is martial, and the sheafing character, who is agricultural, the skeeld and the skeef, is along the same lines as the Aesir and the Vanir in Norse mythology, and this idea of there being these two warring factions of gods, the warrior gods and the fertility gods. And it's them kind of coming together in a single body. And the conflation of these is quite, in the English tradition, is specific to the Beowulf tradition. And in fact, in almost all the other English sources, they're very much separate figures as we've got them here.
But the conflation of them is a particular process, which will be interesting for us to go into more depth on some other time.
And we will. I mean, we're gonna. There's a lot we're gonna cover in the deep dive of this that we won't talk about now, such as the gradual development and the accruing of elements of the story as I gave it. This story, one of the reasons that I've chosen this one in particular is that there's like 1,000 years of English development of this story from the migration of the Anglo-Saxons in about 450 AD, or the beginning of that process, all the way up until I think the latest source for this legend is from the 15th century in the 1400s, and it's in a pedigree for Henry VI, I think. And interestingly, that's where we get this reference to the baby having a sheaf of corn for his pillow. And before that, in the 10th, or no, in the 11th century, we have Athelweid's Chronicle, which is the first chronicle history written by a layman, not by a monk. And that's where we get this thing of Skeefer having this being surrounded by weaponry,
by swords.
So these are very gradual later. I mean, we don't know when they come, but these are additional developments that aren't present in the Beowulf or in the even earlier Widsith reference.
Right, so there's a lot of history to unpack.
Yeah, exactly. There's loads. Too much, I think, for this, but we will deep dive this. To get back to this notion of skeeld skeefing. So there was some scholarly discussion over whether this means the shield with a sheaf as a single character, or more likely, shield of the sheaf. So the skeeld, the kings, the Danish kings who come from the character of shield are called the shieldings, the skeldings. And in that way, skeeld is a skeefing.
Oh, right. So it's a patronymic.
Yeah, it's a patronymic. Yeah. So you would be, what's your dad's name?
Daniel.
You would be a Danieling. You would be James Daniel. You would be a Danieling. If your dad had sort of started this great line of royal king warriors, then they would be called the Danielings, right?
Cool.
And so you would be James Danieling, and your people would be the Danielings, and so it would go on like that, right? So the fact is, shield sheafing means that is acknowledging that he is descended from sheaf.
That there was a parent of that name. Yeah.
Now, the key to that is that shield is born of sheaf, right?
Yeah.
So skeeld comes from skeefer. Also, other sources, Widsith doesn't talk about Scyld. It only talks about Scifa. Calls him a king of the Lombards, right? An entirely different tribe of people who aren't even North Germanic. All the other references are North Germanic. Mm-hmm. That kind of shows the spread, even though all the earliest sources are Old English. This shows that he was known, this figure and this story, or some version of it, was known by many peoples. Mm-hmm. But it was very important to the Old English in particular, hence its inclusion in Widsith and in Beowulf. Furthermore, we have this amazing evidence in a lot of Old English king lists, which are essentially genealogies of the royal houses in the various different English or Anglo-Saxon countries.
Oh, right.
So like Mercia, Wessex, Lindsey, Essex, etc., Kent.
Yeah.
The various different, in older style scholarship, it's called the heptarchy, but people don't really like using that term anymore because it implies there were only 7 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, whereas in fact there were many, many, many kingdoms. It's true, one can argue there were really 7 major Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, and there were many sub-kingdoms. And the borders of those 7 shifted.
In these king lists, are they referring all the way back to purportedly Scifa?
Well, this is interesting. Yeah, some do. Or Skeef in most of the kings lists, I think he's called Skeef. Yeah. And in those kings lists, Skeef's son is Scyld, and Scyld's son is Beowa. Uh-huh. So it specifies that. In some of them, it goes straight from Skeef to Beowa. But in others, it doesn't. So this is how I did. This is how I chose that. And what's even cooler is that in some of them, Woden is the Anglo-Saxon equivalent of Uthen. Uthen actually comes much later than the earliest Anglo-Saxon. In fact, than any of the pagan Anglo-Saxon sources. By quite a bit. The people jumbled them all up together, but the pagan Anglo-Saxon period is much earlier than the Viking period, which again is centuries earlier than the major sources we've got of the stories for Norse mythology being written down. Which, right. I mean, that doesn't, bearing in mind Anglo-Saxon paganism is from around 450 to about the 700s BC, AD rather. It isn't until the 13th century that we get the major sources for the Norse myths written down
by a Christian.
Yeah, by Snorri Sturluson. He was the compiler of the Prose Edda, and there are various other later sources too. But he's really the granddaddy of the Norse mythological sources.
Yeah, he's the one that people have heard of, I think.
Yeah. Oh yeah, everyone's heard of Snorri.
I think a lot of people have.
I'm sure many have, but I think more people have heard of Mick Jagger.
Yeah.
God, that's such an old reference. Mick Jagger was the only person I could think of. I should have said Taylor Swift or something. Why did I say Mick Jagger? Anyway, either way, it fits.
Both more famous than Snorri.
Definitely, yeah. So yeah, that's just to give you an idea of the scale here. Mm-hmm. But Woden was, and still is, in fact, the key ancestor to all Anglo-Saxon kings. They all had to prove descent from Woden.
Wow.
Now, what's cool is that when the Anglo-Saxons become Christianized, they keep Woden in as an ancestral figure because he's that important. And in some cases, Woden, bizarrely, features as a descendant of Scifa, rather than as a father of Scifa.
That's after they've Christianized.
This is after they've Christianized. And also, so it's interesting as well, bearing in mind the significance of the number 9 across for all the Germanic peoples, which, by the way, is a trinity of trinities. It's 3 3s. 9 is very significant. In later Norse mythology, there are 9 worlds. But the only reference we've got for the Anglo-Saxon cosmology says there are 7, which is interesting. And much debated too, but that's what it says. Sorry, guys. This number 9 is interesting because Woden is almost always the 9th generation back from whichever king is being referred to, or the earliest provable literal king. So it's very possible that there's significance in that, and that a list which originally began with Woden is being taken and added to. They're pushing it further back.
Yeah.
What's even cooler then, So yeah, not to get too off track here, because it's going to be very easy.
There's a lot of information,
dear audience. It's going to be very easy for me to fall into the quicksand of dullness and boredom here.
I'm gonna do my best to keep him on track.
If I get boring, blame Jimmy, because I'm trying very hard not to. So where was I, Jimmy?
You were talking about Woden being the 9th generation back from kings.
Yes. All the kings list, essentially, this is what I was saying. The kings list make it very clear that it is Skeef or Skeefer, and he is the father of Skeeld. And then Beowa is the son of Skeeld. So now what's interesting, of course, is that Beowa means barley corn. So we get this cycle from sheaf of corn through shield to barley corn again.
Yeah.
Corn, war, corn, like farming, agriculture to battle to agriculture again. It's this big cycle that's
kind of growing forwards and then dying back, possibly.
Yeah. And this cycle is really a key to this whole story, this whole myth, this whole legend is very much about cycles, about death and rebirth.
Yeah.
And the constant process of that, which is why it ends pretty much as it begins. And that's, in fact...
Yeah, it is. It's cyclical in that way.
Yeah, and that's not my innovation. That's as it is given in the Beowulf account. We start with shield sheafing arriving, and we finish with him dying old and placed on a ship sent back to whoever sent him, to them who sent him. And what's interesting there is that the Beowulf poem is Christianized and talks about God in the Christian sense. However, it refers to the gods who sent him in the first place.
Yes. That's interesting, because we were talking about Woden just there, and I think we've spoken during the first episode, maybe we touched on the idea of grim, this word grim, as a word to denote Woden.
Potentially,
And we were talking at that point about the black dog mythology and or folklore.
Yes.
And how Grimm's barrow can often refer to Woden. And in this story, you refer to the old man, the hooded man, as Grim.
Yeah. So
and he has this madness, which is a key feature.
That is intentional.
Woden.
So he is an Odinic or a Wodenic figure. In my version, he is quite literally that is Woden.
And yet he's unnamed in your story.
He is, and that's intentional.
Yeah.
It is a trope, if you will, or a motif of Germanic myth and legend that Woden or Odin often appears unnamed. They'll give him a different name, or he's never named, but there are certain hints which are given either in the way he is dressed or in referring to him as by a particular descriptor, like Grim, or referring to a madness in his eye or whatever.
And in this case, you've got the lineage of kings as well. He's referred to as a father to to Skeefer.
Yeah, and I made the choice to keep Woden as the father, obviously, because he is, in this, he certainly is the god, and it doesn't make any sense to make him a human who comes later. But moreover, so one of the famous lines in terms of the pagan Woden of the Anglo-Saxons is from the Old English poem, or I say poem, collection of maxims, which is called Maxims. That Maxims 1, and it is Woden Water Weos.
What does that mean?
It means Woden wrought idols.
So what are idols in that?
This is a bit. So it then goes on to say, so it's basically says Woden wrought idols, but God made the heavens, right? So in this instance, it's saying that. But there's, I think last year, Leonard Neidorf, or possibly Neidorf, don't be offended, Len.
If you're listening,
he's a very, very well thought of scholar in this field. He released an article called Woden and Maxims 1. And in it, he delves into the specific meaning of that, the significance of that, and he draws parallels with various other attestations of Woden and other traditions of him and his relationship with idols, and specifically with what are called his tree men. The Woden could carve people out of wood and breathe life into them. And there's an element whereby that seems to make perfect sense in terms of this wooden skiff appearing and this being the creation of man. I wanted there to be a sense in which this could be the first man, the first person.
Yep.
This baby is being created, and that is the first human being, and it is the baby himself then thinks the rest of humanity and everything else into existence. But that baby is the first creature being given. And there is a Norse myth of Odin creating the first man in a similar way through finding, I think, trees and carving them and breathing life in. And there's definite references in the Anglo-Saxon, the Old English record, that demonstrate that Woden made idols. Woden made things, people out of wood. And there's some reference to tree men as well, which demonstrates that all this stuff works and fits within the Anglo-Saxon cosmology. I'm very conscious about not simply transposing the much later Norse cosmology and mythology onto Anglo-Saxon.
Yes.
Because that's wrong. And I think a lot of people in the past have done that. I've made a very, very, very strong point of only using English sources for all of, ideally, Old English, but also I spoke about the Kalevala, the Finnish national epic, and the construction of that in the deep dive for, was it episode 1 or episode 2?
Episode 2, I think.
Episode 2. Yeah, I spoke at length about that. And I've taken a similar approach here in terms of allowing much later oral folklore in certain areas to feed into my interpretations of the truly ancient Anglo-Saxon mythologies.
Right.
We can go into that deeper in the deep dive.
Yeah. Which,
so this is why
by
we're
the way,
on.
if our listeners are not aware,
yes.
the
Tell them all
deep
about it.
dives are a series of videos. Each episode of the podcast we're going to release a long video of just me and Brice talking, unpacking.
A companion piece, basically, a deep dive, long form companion piece discussion where we don't worry about being entertaining and we just go really.
We don't worry about
really
time.
hard. Yeah,
we just keep going until we can't go anymore.
Ages and ages and ages. Yeah, but I think they're great. I think they're really cool.
It's a lot of fun, and I find them interesting.
They're for the hardcore listener, the more discerning audience member.
But if what we're saying on the podcast piques your interest and you want to know more, we can go into more detail.
Head over to YouTube and enjoy those. They'll usually come out about a week after the podcast.
Yeah, that's what we're doing at the moment. Seems to be pretty good.
If you like that, tell us. If you want it sooner, tell us. If you don't want it at all, tell us. We are but your servants.
So that's the deep dive.
That's what a deep dive is. That's what a deep dive is. So yeah, you're right. You're right in saying that seems like Woden because that is Woden. He is the father figure in this version.
Yeah.
These king lists aren't just boring. And in fact, let's just do a brief sidebar and talk about the song, I think.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Because that's really relevant to this. The song by the wonderful Portsmouth Shantymen, by the way.
They were great.
We had a lovely day.
Really fun recording.
A really lovely day with them. The Portsmouth Shantymen, by the way, we heard 4 of the 5. The 4 we had were Pete Luscombe, Pete Watkinson, John Lansley, and Rod Smith, 3 of whom have literally worked on tall ships.
Great.
Jimmy was taught how to tie knots and use and treat his sound cables like they're shipping ropes.
Yeah, they were showing me. Yeah.
They were lovely old men, and they really, the entire approach that they had was so powerful and positive. They really were in it for the love of it, and they really know what they're doing. It's been around since 1978.
Well, there was a particular reason that you chose
to
get in touch with them, wasn't it? What was that?
So this song, a long time ago, or a very long time ago, which is also called In Frisco Bay. There's another version which begins with a line in Frisco Bay.
Yeah.
Though it is English. That's an Americanized version. This song is about Noah's Ark, usually.
Okay.
The lyrics that we've got are my introduction, and I'll explain why in a moment. Usually the lyrics tell a fun little story set on Noah's Ark about an argument between a bull and a cow, and then a dog sticks his nose through the
nose.
All that, essentially. It's a lovely little story. It's actually a really good shanty too, and it's one people don't really know about. The Anglo-Saxons, after Christianization, we're talking about these king lists, they decided to Christianize it by simply adding, in all the lists, Skifa is the first, right? Except for the Christianized ones, whereby they add Noah on top of Skifa.
They add Noah.
Yeah. Yeah, the idea is that, okay, well, Skeefer was a little baby found in the water.
Found floating in the water after the flood.
Yeah, after the flood. Therefore, Noah must have had a kid and then just chucked him over the side during the flood. And then, so I guess it's Noah's kid. And then he takes Noah's traditional descent.
Right. So the shanty is, the original shanty is about Noah. So the original shanty is a song about Noah. Put that in one side. Okay,
in another side, the story that we've got, when the Anglo-Saxons became Christianized, they made the story of Skeefer okay by making Skeefer a secret son of Noah.
Yeah.
So they backward engineered the ancient legend of Skeefer to staple it into the Noah story. So what I've done is I've taken a shanty about Noah and I've backwards engineered it to be telling the story of Skeefer. Because
that'll show them.
Yeah. Well, no, not even to get back, just because that very process is what the Anglo-Saxons did. So by repeating that process, just in reverse, we are working in that same English tradition.
Yeah. Cool.
And the lyrics, by the way, were not my own creation exactly. They were my own translation of the lines that tell this story from Beowulf itself. The lyrics that we used were my translation from the Old English, from the various. I obviously moved them about a bit, and some of them are more loose translation because they had to fit the rhythm and the structure. But yeah, the lyrics are from the Old English. The lyrics are the story of Skeefer, Skeel Skeefing, from Beowulf itself.
Great.
So what we've got there is ancient lyrics translated from the Old English, backwards engineered onto a shanty about Noah, because that's exactly how the Anglo-Saxons chose to backwards engineer the story itself.
And particularly those two subjects, the Skeefer, Skeeld, and Noah. Yeah, they're so intimately connected.
The Anglo-Saxons loved the Noah story. The flood in general, for some reason, for whatever reason, culturally really clicked with the Anglo-Saxons.
Floated their boat,
precisely. They very much did that. They loved it. There's an extended poem about it, which is a really good poem. And the very fact that they added to the story with this element. Some, they were a seafaring people, so perhaps there's that element. But a lot of people were seafaring peoples. I'm not sure that necessarily explains it. Might be an element of it, though. Now, the first version of this shanty, the earliest version of this shanty in its sort of Noah's Ark, in any form, is, I told you it was English, but it was actually recorded in the Portsmouth workhouse.
Which is why we went to the Portsmouth
Shantymen, because Portsmouth is where we first hear this shanty, and so what better group than the Portsmouth Shantymen to actually come and then sing it for us and rewild it with this literally, I mean, somewhere between 1,000 and 1,400-year-old set of lyrics. I really love it.
From Beowulf. Lyrics from Beowulf.
Literally lyrics from Beowulf. Yeah, I was really happy with it. This is a good example of the previous two songs we've done. There's been a lot less of that kind of, I don't know what you'd call it, but that kind of creative approach or lateral approach in this. It's not reconstruction, it's more than that.
Interfering,
precisely. Yeah. So I don't know. Some people might be familiar with this, with Tolkien's tower analogy.
It rings a bell, but I can't remember what it is. Can you
anybody interested in any of this should read
The Road to Middle-earth by
Tom Shippey. The Road to Middle-earth by Tom Shippey. You could also, if you're interested in Beowulf, buy Tom Shippey's new translation of Beowulf. It's very, very good. So Tolkien gives this analogy of a man who builds a tower out of the remains of things that have gone before. And he talks about how generations later, people come and they deconstruct it and say, oh, look how stupid that man was. None of these bits used to make up a tower. So they take the tower all to pieces and they put them all separate, all the different old things he made the tower up of. They deconstruct it and they put each one of those items in separate places so they can be properly viewed and explained. But at the end of the day, there's now no tower. And they are oblivious to the fact that the man had originally built that tower so he could climb to the top of it and look out and have a beautiful view of the sea.
Yeah.
So by obsessing over these weird origins, they've destroyed the thing which had value in itself.
You lose the view of the sea.
Yeah, precisely. You lose the view of the sea. And I think it's really important to keep the view of the sea and to recognize the value in the tower itself. To allow these various, to not pathologically deconstruct everything, but to enjoy the construction. Guys, sometimes when you're in the middle of a thunderstorm, you will really wish that you had a construct around that you could shelter under, frankly. I mean, I think constructs are far more useful to society than obsessive deconstructors, especially when it comes to this sort of thing. Story, myth, legend. As I said, I think the key to this story is the cyclical nature of it. It's all beginnings and ends, and the ends themselves being beginnings, and the beginnings themselves being ends, permanently and forever. And that's the great myth that's being told here. You quite rightly pointed out this idea of, and I mean, it says it explicitly in the story. Yeah, this idea of warriors settling and becoming farmers, and farmers then growing with enough prosperity to indulge in becoming artists. This process. Yeah. I'm not the first person to recognize this cyclical element in the story, in Skifa and Shield, and Beowulf for that matter. It's important not to forget Beowulf, really important not to forget Beowulf. He's actually he's the key so far as I'm concerned, and he's an element that hasn't really been engaged with by previous writers on this subject. Right.
Tolkien, because he's reborn.
He is
an
reborn,
interesting. So maybe if we're talking about a cyclical structure, then you have birth with Skifa, you have death with Shield, and you have rebirth with Beowulf.
Absolutely,
and rebirth is the part that makes that exceptional.
Exactly that.
Birth and death are things that we all experience, but rebirth
is the key.
Is the thing that really makes it a
Georges de Mézil refers famously to this tripartite concept of Indo-European social structure, whereby everyone is divided into three different classes. There's the priestly class, there's the cultivator class, the farmers and the producers, and there's the warrior class, right? Other commentators have looked at this and said, okay, well, we clearly have the cultivator class and the warrior class in Shield and Skifa, but there's no priestly class. And some people have said, well, this shows the Christianization of it, because the unspoken third class is God himself, so you don't need to say him. I think that's a bit of a reach myself.
Yep.
I prefer to look at Beowulf and see how he can be this priestly godly class. And if Beowulf is about rebirth, is the rebirth himself, then of course that becomes the supernatural, the deified, this godly thing.
Right.
It gets even more now, and Beowulf really has been ignored, partly because early translators mistakenly just thought it said Beowulf, not Beowulf. They were wrong. What's cool about the Beowulf focus in particular, and a lot of this rebirth stuff, you can then, because Beowulf means barleycorn, you can see in stories and traditions around the folk song John Barleycorn. I thought it'd be too on the nose to do John Barleycorn as a song.
In the song.
But keep tuned, dear listeners, because we may just have a barleycorn for you later, but not today, not now. Beowulf, meaning barleycorn, would be cognates to the Old Norse big, which was the word for grain.
Oh, okay.
Right? Now, big in the Norse is also Bigvir, who was a minor god. He was a servant of Freyr, right? And so in that we have, with him being a servant of Freyr, we've got some connection to fertility and to birth in some far removed Norse tradition. Yeah. Now, furthermore, some people have posited that Bigvir, big, might also be related to the Finnish Pekko.
What does that mean?
The Finnish god of Pekko is a Finnish spirit of barley, of the barleycorns, and of drink, of beer that's brewed from the barleycorn, right? Pekko. What's even cooler, to jump all the way back to the last episode, to Sprack Jack, in New Forest dialect, another word for a sheaf of corn is a puck.
Oh, we're getting back to the Pixies.
We're going back to the Pixies.
Lovely.
We're going back to the Pixies. So we've got Puck, Pekko, Bigvir, big, Beowa.
I'm trying to interpret what all of these connections add up to.
Yeah, Christ knows. I don't know. Christ!
It's interesting.
Christ knows, Beowa knows, Skeefer knows, Woden knows, but I don't. It means something, and it's this idea of it's elevating farming and agriculture to something supernatural, almost.
Yes,
Something truly godly.
Possibly what you could say it adds up to is that Beowa starts to seem like a more deified,
absolutely,
or
absolutely
supernatural
does.
figure.
Yeah, very much so. A more supernatural figure, and for me, that's key. I also think that in our time story, we've emphasized it's the whole transition from being a wandering, warring people to settling and then growing and farming. And there is this idea that it's this transition from the wandering bands of nomads for whom it was all about cattle.
Yeah.
To settled farmers. That was what enabled civilization in the sense that we know it to develop.
Agriculture.
Yeah, agriculture, precisely. I've then chose to interpret it by this addition of art and artistry. And I believe, and this is not without historic precedent either, that we can see this notion of creating art as something godly or something magical, supernatural. In the Anglo-Saxon, and in fact across all the Germanic sources, stories and storytelling and poetry and music is associated with the gods specifically. And that's not just in the Germanic sources, but even in the ancient Greek and many other traditions, we see the gift of song, of music, of poetry as coming from the gods. So in this sense, even if we don't have someone who is explicitly priestly, this addition of artistry, of music, fulfills that, because that is, as Tolkien termed it, that is subcreation, which is the most godly act the human being can do. Whereby creation, and this, of course, Tolkien is coming from an explicitly Catholic perspective. So Tolkien talked about creation as being the act of God, and the most beautiful, perfect way that a human being with their life can enact servitude to God and can worship and glorify God is through sub-creation, which is creation within his true creation. The only true creation is God's, and what we can do is sub-creation. That's what he intended to do with his entire cosmology.
I find that more approachable, really, for it to be about art and music, rather than something sort of more explicitly religious. Coming from like not a religious background myself, I imagine there's a lot of people who sort of feel that way in a modern audience. Yeah, see, I mean, I think you're right. Certainly, in Britain today, we do live in a fairly in a society which I think can be classed as post-religious. I'm not sure that this is. There's no judgment on whether that's a good or a bad thing, but I think it is, and I think you're right. Certainly, people of our generation generally are uncomfortable with religion if it's engaged with head on. Yeah, being uncomfortable with it is a good way of putting it. It's interesting. I think in quite a lot of instances, it's easy to. I think it's easy to misinterpret what I'm doing here. What's happening here, as art being a proxy for religion. Yeah, because that's something that is done in the old stories, isn't it? It's a representation of spiritual life. Yeah, well, yeah. So I see. This is the thing. I think that division is very much a modern one that we're projecting onto it explicitly because of that insecurity around religion that many people have. I chose to engage with a harp because the harp is so closely related to Anglo-Saxon culture and also specifically to Anglo-Saxon storytelling culture. Yeah. And a harp can be made out of bones. And this idea of creating an instrument out of the bones of some older being is really interesting. I think symbolically, there's a lot of stuff going on there. It also then ties into a later myth about Geet, who is also put down as a descendant of Beowa in the King's lists. But that's in the book. You'll need to read my lovely book. I just want to quickly pick up on the because this idea of accessibility to me as a modern audience, I found some stuff in this story really pleasingly mysterious. Pleasingly, you didn't hand it to me on a plate. It was really kind of I had to put two and two together. Like all you told me was that he went and saw the old hooded man, and the madness came into him, and then he went and sacrificed his son. We didn't get the
he didn't get you should do this because of this.
Which the Bible
which
version you do get that.
And I think that's better. I don't think you should be. I think so often,
but I felt like that contributed to the dream logic of it. It contributed to the feeling of it being a kind of I don't know, a mysterious myth dream.
Well, it is. That's because it is that, and that's because it's as it should be. Too often, translators in general will destroy something by doing this literal translation. They don't know when to stop. So they'll take something that could be a poetic metaphor, and they'll just translate it so it literally means the thing it literally says, and the whole thing is killed off. I referred to bones as bloodwood at one point, which is a lovely kenning for any interested. I love this story because it really is a truly ancient story. And there's this horrible commonplace idea that it's very much, it's regularly thrown out, almost instinctively, that no legends or myths from the Anglo-Saxon times have survived. We've got almost nothing exists. And it's just not true. Just as I mentioned in the previous episode, the previous chat, I think, this idea that some theories don't exist to help explain or to enable understanding.
Yeah, they just exist to shut things down.
Yeah, they exist to stop you talking about it. They exist to justify not knowing things and to facilitate a continuance of not knowing
absolutely.
things.
You can say the same of when people say, oh, nothing really exists from then.
Yeah.
Exactly.
That
completely shuts down all discussion.
Exactly. Yeah. There's hardly anything exists. Everything is.
Don't even bother looking.
Yeah. Exactly that. But people love that. They love that because it means they don't have to. They already know everything there is to know. They don't have to think about anything more. And anyone who seems like they know, they're idiots. I know more than them. It's all supposition, and that's what most people are motivated by. It's not true. There's actually a lot of Old English sources, and there's a lot to be found in them. For anyone interested in a mythic telling of many of these tales, I do recommend Anglo-Saxon Myths, The Struggle for the Seven Kingdoms.
Oh, who's that by?
Who's that by? It's by a beautiful man. A beautiful man named Brice Stratford. It's published by Batsford. Recommend get a beautiful copy for Christmas, perhaps. This is one of those stories which doesn't even require much work to reconstruct or to unearth or to excavate. It's there. The story is told.
Yeah,
it's told. And different people now tell it differently for different audiences. And the one you've just heard, dear listeners, is a great example of that. But the story exists. It's one of those legends that we supposedly don't have. And Beowulf is riddled with them. Heremod is a good example. So in the Beowulf story, Shield Sheafing or Skeeld Skeefing is the first king after this evil, terrible king, Heremod of the Wolvish mind. And he was specifically this awful king who ruined the entire nation. He was, essentially his problem was he got really old. He was a boomer. So he came directly before Skeeld Skeefing. He was a great king once upon a time, a long time ago, but
a long time
ago. But this
and
great,
a very long time.
That's the trouble. It was a very long time ago. He, in his youth and in his prime, he was a great king, a powerful, fine warrior, deeply generous. And in Germanic culture, in ancient Germanic culture, generosity is one of the key prerequisites of a good king, of good kinning. You must be generous. You must enrich your followers.
Yeah.
And that's sort of one of the trade-offs for the intense loyalty that they give to you. They therefore have an obligation to never flee, to always be. They must always try to be as brave as you, and you must always be braver than them. It is, you cannot break this code.
There's kind of contract between king and people.
It's the comitatus is the word that we usually use for it, though it's a Latin word, so I don't like that. But this is the Dreit, the warrior code, the ethics of the ancient Germanic peoples.
So where does this wolvish mind come in?
Well, the wolvish mind comes in because he he begins young and powerful and strong,
Yeah.
but he grows old. And as he starts to age, suddenly this great, wonderful, powerful, glorious king who's used to being gloried and worshipped and looked up to, he starts to look about and he notices there are other younger, stronger, better looking people around him. And so he has a choice, as do we all, James. He has a choice, and
each generation.
Yeah, each generation in turn. He can either look to enrich the younger generation. He can look to encourage and facilitate and help aid them in moving forward and see himself as part of that continuum.
Like passing the torch.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or it doesn't even have to be him. He doesn't have to give up his kingship. He can make his call about building the new generation, and so they and onward. Or he can try to hold on, and he can compete with them. He can see them as competition, and he chooses that latter. And he gets older and older, and weaker, and he becomes more and more paranoid and more desperate. And this culminates this awful ego worship. This culminates in his committing one of the great moral atrocities, whereby he slays his companions at board. He takes his most loyal warriors, his most loyal subjects, the great men who'd won him all that he had, and he brings them around a table for a good, jolly, lovely feast, and he has them all slain when they least expect it, so that no one is greater than he, no one more powerful, no one better.
So not only lacking the generosity of that comitatus, but actively betraying his people.
Actively betraying his people. And as a consequence of this mad raving king, the land starts to fall into decay, into disrepair. Everything starts to go to hell. Essentially, the entire structure of society here becomes twisted to support this single generation at the expense of future generations. The young are cannibalized to keep the ever-dwindling old just able to pretend that they aren't dwindling.
And so that kind of natural, healthy cycle is broken.
Yes, precisely. The cycle is broken, and that's what's so important. The cycle is broken, and everything goes to hell. It's very telling that is what precedes this story in Beowulf. This story of the cycle and the importance of the cycle, beginning with birth, death, rebirth, and acknowledging the importance of the future and sacrificing the present for the future. That's the key to all of this, to everything really, is to plant trees under whose shade you will never sit, but which future generations can bask in the shade of and enjoy the glorious vista that is produced.
Well, I think that you have planted a tree here for future generations.
Well, I'm very happy to hear it. Fingers crossed, that's the hope.
Yeah.
On which note, I don't know if you ever heard of barley bread, James.
No, I have not.
That's right, dear listeners. We are now at that segment of the podcast in which
the dreaded segment,
the controversial moment in which I describe to you a historic English recipe that has some relevance to the episode. This is slightly more creative than previous ones. Obviously, this has been about beowa, meaning barley.
Yep.
Barley bread is a very, very, very long.
Is it made from people?
Oh, actually, I did look into bone bread.
Which is made from people.
Well, no, it's not. It sounds like it should be. And there was a rumor that the French at one point were so hungry they went and ground bones from the to make bread, which is potentially where the line in the fee fi fo fum. I smell the blood of an Englishman. Be he alive or be he dead, I'll grind his bones to make my bread. Yeah. It wouldn't work. You can't make bread by grinding bones, by the way, folks.
Not even of an Englishman.
Not even of an Englishman. Well, maybe that was the problem. Maybe the French they were only using French bones. It might have worked. Well, let's not.
Only one way to find out.
You could try.
Sorry, but
there is something called bone bread, but it's unrelated. It's it's made in the shape of a bone.
Oh, okay.
And it wasn't quite interesting enough for me. So instead, I've gone a bit more creative.
Yeah.
Barley bread is very, very, very old, and pretty much for as long as anyone in England has been making bread. They've been making barley bread. References to it survive from the early 1600s, but it being such a commonplace thing, the actual recipes come much later. Essentially, this was much cheaper to make than bread with wheat flour, and perfectly lovely too, a very nice one. So this particular recipe, or receipt, if we're going to use the proper English term rather than recipe, which is a French term, I suppose we should start using the word receipt. Yeah. In our podcast, shouldn't we? All right. The correct
receipt.
Yeah, this receipt is from the Southern Reporter of the 18th of July, 1918. Barley bread. Mix 2 pounds of barley flour with a small teaspoonful of salt. Rub 1 ounce of yeast smooth with a teacup full of tepid water and pour it into the center of the flour. Make it into a light dough with more warm water and set near the fire to rise. When risen to twice its size, knead the dough well. Then put it into 2 greased tins and let it rise again for half an hour. Bake in a brisk oven. 2 pounds of barley flour should make 3 pounds of bread. Now, that's a bit boring, I hear you all say.
I was thinking it sounds a lot like bread.
Yeah, it's basically bread, but made with barley flour. There's also something which, in a similar way, there's loads of old references to this, but because it's such an obvious thing to make, they don't bother giving a recipe. It's literally just make bread, but use barley flour. Takes a little bit longer to cook, but it's essentially exactly the same aside from that. There's also something called beer bread. Beer bread made from beer. Now, that's obviously relevant to this story because we already mentioned how Skeefer makes this beer.
Special mind-bending beer.
Special mind-bending beer that is shown to him in his
psychedelic
frenzy dreams. Yeah. And he then can drink this beer to have a taste of the madness, and then the fragments he remembers can be passed on. Beer and bread are essentially the same ingredients. They're just prepared slightly differently. It's only the cooking that burns the bread down that stops it being alcoholic. So I think combining beer bread, a really simple recipe for beer bread, by the way. This particular recipe, by the by, is from Jamie Oliver. But it's just such a basic, simple recipe. And much like with the barley bread, it existed for ages and it just nobody wrote it down. Essentially, with beer bread, okay, so the Jamie Oliver recipe is that super, super simple. Terrible simple. You get 375 grams of flour and you get a 330 milliliter bottle of beer. And then you pour the beer into the flour. You add 3 teaspoons of sugar. You stir it up. You don't even need to whisk it or knead it. You just stir it up. Shove it in a tin, a loaf tin or a cake tin that's been buttered, greased with butter. Drizzle a little bit of melted butter on. Greased with butter or grease. I mean, I think it would be really nice with lard, actually. But grease that. What isn't? Grease that. Then drizzle a bit melted on top and put it in the oven at 180 degrees centigrade for 50 minutes. I made you some today, James, in fact.
I did. It was very nice.
Yes, it's really nice.
Thank you for that.
And I just used a really cheap naff beer because I happen to have some of that left over because nobody wants to drink it. But he recommends that you use something like Proper Job from St. Austell's brewery, I think, or something either very hoppy or very malty to get more taste. But honestly, I just used a horrible cheap lager and it was really nice, like really nice. Yeah. So what I propose doing is combining those two recipes. Essentially, the way that you turn any bread recipe into a beer bread recipe is you replace you don't have to put any yeast in or anything like that to raise it because the beer has that in. And you just remove the raising thing, the yeast or the balm if it's an older recipe, and you replace all the liquid that goes in with beer. So I would propose
a synthesis of those two things that you've just described.
Either whereby you take the barley recipe and you don't add in any yeast, but you replace the water measurements with beer, or you simply try the much simpler beer bread recipe I just gave you from Jamie Oliver, and you just use barley flour instead of wheat flour. You might have to change the baking times a little bit, so keep an eye on it. If after 50 minutes it still doesn't look nice, maybe give it another 10, 15 minutes, perhaps. But just keep an eye on it. So essentially, I would say, get yourself 375 grams of barley flour, 330 milliliter, that's like a standard small bottle of a beer. A nice beer will probably be nicer. But, as I say, I used a cheap naff beer, and it was absolutely lovely bread. And maybe why waste nice beer? I don't know. Add that, 3 teaspoons full of sugar, stir it all up together, mix it around just with a big spoon, doesn't need anything special. Heavily butter or lard I used a cake tin, so you get a much nicer shaped loaf then. And then drizzle the remaining, I then drizzled over the top. I used melted butter that I'd fried some bacon in, so it had a little bit of extra bacon fat. So I then drizzled that on top, and I put it in, and I would say put it in at 180 degrees centigrade, check it after 50 minutes, and then maybe give it another 5 minutes, checking it again, another 5 minutes after that. Then, to combine it with our final and third recipe, I know, there's, again, a really classic English recipe, which is quite simply toast with bone marrow butter on. And all you do for that is you get some chunks of bone with the marrow still in from the butcher, and you roast it or boil it so that the marrow is soft, and then you take it off immediately and you smear it on the toasted bread.
So the one ingredient,
bone marrow. Then just smear bone marrow on top. So what we've done there is we've taken 3 historic English recipes: barley bread, beer bread, and bone marrow butter.
Yep,
which is literally just bone marrow, but used as butter. We've combined them into a single item.
Great,
yeah, lovely synthesis, and we've created something that obviously has great. So this is all good historical traditional recipes, but combined and remixed, maybe? I don't know, shaken about. Yeah. And we once again have the matted hair of the folk. Lots of different traditions combining. So we get the bone of the instrument, we get the beer, and we get the barley all in one.
Potentially, we could also try that bread out with last week's episode's recipe
for fairy butter. Yes,
fairy butter.
Yeah, toasted.
Might work well in there.
Yeah, that would be. I can see that working very well.
I think maybe we should possibly look into rather than giving times for cooking, we should start looking into what prayers you should say.
Oh yes,
to time.
You're right.
Your
of course,
cooking.
we should.
Because you can,
which songs to sing, which charms to chant. Yeah. Okay. All right. Stay. Keep abreast, listeners.
We'll see what we can do. That might be a lot of research to.
Yeah. I mean, let's start with calling them receipts instead of recipes, and then we'll see how far we can take it.
How many Our Fathers you have to say to bake your bread?
Yeah. So I would say we can call this. This is barley beer bread with bone marrow butter. Lovely. It's pretty good. Barley beer bread with bone marrow butter. And it also, I mean, I haven't yet combined them all, but I've had barley bread, which is very nice. I've had beer bread, which is really nice. And I've had bone marrow butter, which is lovely. So all those things combined would be great and is the perfect synthesis of food tradition and folk tradition and story.
Great. Well, let us know, listeners, if you manage to try out our recipes.
We'll let you know if we manage to try out that synthesis, that synthesized recipe. And in the meantime, I mentioned this earlier, that Tolkien had done a poetic telling of this story.
Oh, good.
And as it is fair use, I'm going to read you a section.
Please do.
And the poem is called King Sheave. This is just a chunk from about halfway through. Sheave, they called him, whom the ship brought them. A name renowned in the North countries ever since in song. For a secret hidden his true name was, in tongue unknown of far countries, where the falling seas wash western shores, beyond the ways of men since the world worsened. The word is forgotten, and the name perished. Their need he healed, and laws renewed long forsaken. Words he taught them wise and lovely. Their tongue ripened in the time of Sheave to song and music. Secrets he opened, runes revealing. Riches he gave them, reward of labour, wealth and comfort from the earth calling. Acres ploughing, sowing in season seed of plenty. Hoarding in Ghana golden harvest for the help of men. The hoar forests in his days drew back to the dark mountains. The shadow receded, and shining corn, white ears of wheat, whispered in the breezes where waste had been. The woods trembled
This was Finding Folklore, Episode 3 of Sheaf and Shield with Brice Stratford and James Carney. The shanty A Long Time Ago was performed by the Portsmouth Shantymen, Pete Luscombe, Pete Watkinson, John Lansley and Rod Smith. The theme music is by Su Eaton. Join us next time in Finding Folklore.